Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ICA. I'm Stephen Cairns, Associate Curator of Artist's Film and Moving Image. It's been a great pleasure to work with Adam Linder on this performance project. So today we're going to talk about that, and over the next 40 minutes we're going to share with you some of the background to the project and also some of the background to Adam's practice. At the end, there'll be an opportunity for questions, so if anyone has any questions as we go, please do hold on to those, and at the end we can discuss. Without further ado, I think we just get on. We are, of course, in the space in which Choreographic service number 3, Some Writing, is hired, which takes place over 4 to 5 hours per day, so if you haven't seen the service already, please do spend some time this afternoon with it. This is, of course, Choreographic service number 3, so the first question I have for Adam, which is maybe not so much a question but a prompt, is if you would tell us just a bit about the other choreographic services and how you first came to conceive the series.
So the first one is called Some Cleaning, and it's this premise that a performer will choreographically clean a given environment. All the services work within this model of a service, so they're hired per hour or per day. And with Some Cleaning, there's a kind of vocabulary of movements that the performer uses like a toolbox, which may organize or dust or rearrange the space. Of course, these are happening choreographically, so there's a very close kind of proximity to like mimetic gestures. There's a very functional kind of attitude, but there's a lot of fiction because these actions are being made with the body. And then Some Proximity involves 2 dancers and an art writer, and where all 3 of us are working in the same environment, so or location, depending on where the hire takes place. And the writer is moving around the space and working as a writer would, reflecting, making kind of short notes. And these kind of short critical statements go on kind of A4 pieces of paper and are pinned around the room, or a room, where 2 performers are using a kind of glide form of dancing. So it's this kind of like footwork, very kind of agile footwork. And at the same time as kind of vocalizing these texts, the texts become kind of like these vocal generators for the movement. And I think what I was really hoping, or what I'm hoping to service with that work, is this idea that a critical reflection on an environment, whether it be a museum or even a kind of public location or a private domestic location, becomes somehow like that the expressivity of the body kind of collapses this critical distance that we know of from kind of the history of like language and criticism. And then Some Writing is what we're presenting here.
Something that's quite unique about the series of services is they are all hireable at any time. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about how those have been hired in the past and the sorts of places that have hired them?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, my interest with the services is really to think about a format for choreography that means that it can be kind of it's a kind of transactional, transferable form of choreography that doesn't rely on theater conditions, but is really this kind of like singular action that will service something or serve something. And this is the format of the service, and why I use that is because to treat choreography or as an object that can be bought, that is then possessed, that is then kind of transferred in this way to another owner, is antithetical for me to the idea of choreography, in which the activity, the knowledge is really held in the body. However, in a thoroughly kind of modern, like economized society, there needs to be some kind of underwriting for the reality of the labor. So for me, a service is the kind of the most relevant format for this, because it denotes a finite period of time. The work is enacted, the service happens, but it's not obtained. It's not collected. It cannot be speculated upon in the same way that an object can. So it was a way for me to somehow parse a choreographic practice within other contexts other than the theater. And I would say it's generally being taken up in kind of visual art institutional formats. It has been hired privately in one instance. I hope it would happen again, because I think that's that's another really interesting kind of setup for that transaction. So it's really like thinking about how this choreographic labor can be underwritten and understood as work, as something with value that has a format that is not trying to place choreography within a commodity form that it doesn't belong to.
I think it's also important to note that choreographic service number 1, Some Cleaning, was 2013, is that right?
Yes.
At the same time, you conceived works for the theatre, so in 2013 Parade, and then most recently Vex Vistas this year. How do those two relate? How does the theatre-based practice relate to things that are more hinged on the art world economy, the kind of institutional structures?
Well, I think they're just two very different histories and architectures and definitely ways of receiving work as a viewer. And I think at the heart of my work, the questions inside my work, which are a lot about how language how verbal language and codified language, whether that's verbal or even languages of the body, how they kind of intersect, what are their provenances, how they're valued or exploited, what are the conditions for them. I think that is always at the root of my work, whether it's in the theatre or it's within the format of the services. But what I can do in the theatre is that I can treat the experience of viewing a choreographic work differently. So I can stage it. I can deal with a very kind of sculpted, singular perspective that the viewer looks from. I can treat time differently. So I'm aware of taking care of the experience from A to Z in the theatre. There's a different kind of social contract that happens in a theatre than the one that happens in a space like this. I can also treat images differently. I can work with amplified sound in a different way. I can raise the saturation of choreographic images with light. So when I work in the theatre, I very much so wholeheartedly take on these kind of meaty factors of the theatre. And then what I've been doing with the services is really zeroing in on maybe the kind of, like really zeroing in on, in a very distilled way on maybe the more kind of like discursive and singular aspects of how I'm thinking about choreography. So the services, it's often a very, it's this kind of singular conceptual premise that gives way to something being enacted. But it's, the choreographic material, the content is very distilled in a different way to how I would work in the theatre, where there would be a kind of consecutive series of scenes that relate in not necessarily in a narrative sense, but with a sense of understanding a dramaturgical structure.
Coming back to the services, choreographic service number 1, some cleaning, you make very explicit, or to me, explicit parallels with immaterial labour and kind of sociological and political histories with waged labour, and cleaning being something that should be considered a waged labour. And I took a quote from the text that you and Francis, the other dancer, recite for this piece, which I'm going to read out. Temporarily employed, temporarily an employee, but soon not to be. My labour is so flexible. So, with that in mind, I wanted to ask you about the critical aspects of this structure that you've implemented, this per hour or per day service, and just what some of those political connotations are.
Yeah, with some cleaning, I was, it was the first service, and I didn't think it was necessarily going to become a series, but what I realized was that it was such a productive format to work within after I made that. I think with some cleaning, it really started from me playing with that gesture. Like, that was the first entry point. And then I was like, oh, that would be really great to like have this scene where I had to like clean the space before I could perform in it, And I just built it up from there, and then started thinking about it discursively and researching. And of course, there's a feminist precedence for the work, especially in Miele Lademan Ukele's work, her maintenance project of the late 60s, don't quote me on the date, but it might be around 68. And so I think, what happens there is that there's this very kind of rational structure that's laid out, this kind of, advocating for this per hour kind of sustenance for this work. But with all the services, it's the body that's doing them. It's the body in a choreographic manner. So it's a very kind of, almost like a kind of, like a kind of rational or critical angle that is giving way to something highly expressive and is not just somehow contained within some kind of critical commentary. The critical kind of crux is the starting point, but it's enlivened through this action. And so for me, it's always this kind of, I don't feel like they start from that point, and I don't feel like they're some kind of like critical shutting off. I feel like they're a critical opening up. And so it says, okay, let's think about this premise, let's put forward this premise, let's put forward an ethic for which I want to work, but let's like materialize this with all the ambiguousness, all the messiness, the sweatiness, the dynamic of the body. And I think that's where the works very much so move away from this kind of very contained and contained and kind of tightened, like more kind of institutional critical model, because there's no, in a way, there's no given for the work. Like, the way it materializes in that moment, in that real-time moment, and it's like sweaty and tired and, you know.
Do you think, to some extent, there's an institutional critique of the art world and the services, obviously, much more so than the theatre-based works, directly engage with that art world? So to a certain extent, there is a criticality of that art world in which performance generally is becoming much more popular within. Is there a dialogue there, or is there a comment that you make with the work there on that?
I don't know if there's there's definitely a dialogue. I don't want to say there's a comment, because I don't think there's like a definitive answer that I have to these questions. Again, like, it's a kind of ethic that I put forward. But of course, in thinking through the format of the service, you know, I was so aware that, like, my work started to be invited more and more into visual arts, and I think it was because of this kind of more conceptual way I was thinking about dance. And then I developed the services, and I think I was aware that performance, in this kind of resurgent interest that was happening, was being kind of used as either a magnet, like a kind of event magnet, where you could pull in an audience, you could gain visibility, it would be proliferated on Instagram, and that would be a kind of, performance would be this tool for building audiences. I mean, there's many different things that I can say about that, but, like, you know, I'm often kind of contacted by the public programs person in an institution, because, you know, and I find that very interesting and peculiar, you know. So performance can be this, like, interface, this kind of, like, bodily, human, person-to-person interface with the public that institution doesn't yet have. Mm-hmm. And I think that is curious, and so, like, performance becomes this kind of pawn mm-hmm. in this game, and so I was aware of that, and I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about, well, how can I, you know, this format is really like, you know, you hire it, it's a transaction between me and the institution, it doesn't need to be viewed, there will be, you know, we will be in this room potentially for an hour at a time where no one comes in, it still happens, you know, so it's like, how can you move this thing away from spectatorship, you know, from being so reliant on spectatorship and the spectacle, while still being open and porous to being viewed and talked about. I mean, in the way that the contract is displayed, I think it's very transparent what these conditions are. So I was thinking about that, and then as I've moved along in the service, what felt really gratifying as a line of thinking was that actually it's the format the performing arts have always been framed within, you know, serving effective labor. They've always been, you know, you pay your ticket, you go to the theatre, you pay your ticket, you know what you're going to get, you're going to see a 1-hour show at Sadler's Wells, you know, and you're not going to leave with owning it, you're not going to leave with being able to place it in an archive, you're going to leave with an experience that is somehow contained within that that temporal moment. And so that's really gratifying, because it feels like this is always what performing arts have been doing, serving these kind of effective dynamics. They've not been archiving themselves. They've not been making themselves into like object form, you know.
We'll come on to talking about choreographic service number 3 in more detail in a second, but before we do that, there's one more point that I wanted to make, and I also wanted to hear just a bit of input from you on the development of those now 3 services. Some cleaning was yourself as choreographer and dancer, but choreographic service number 2 is some proximity. You, again, choreographer and dancer, but you work with another dancer and a writer. And I think that the inclusion or involvement with the writer is quite significant, particularly when we go on to talk about the service that we've hired at the ICA. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about those relationships, about becoming the kind of the key person within a network of people.
Yeah, I mean, that's also a really gratifying part of the work, is that I get to meet people and invite them in to work with me. And I think this is kind of leaning back on that last question, or what we were talking about there, is I think in kind of a history of visual arts and in the tendencies of performance works in visual art, often there's been this precedence of a score or a set of instructions that is the core of the work. And this we've seen as a model that's come from late 60s, early 70s minimal conceptual performance, even Judson dance, to performance practices that are happening now. And what happens is that instruction or that concept is really the kind of unlocking key to the work, and that's what's really valued. That's what we're really talking about. But I think what happens there is that the performers, the actual bodies and subjects that enliven and enact these works, become very dispensable. And that's what I wanted to work around. So I wanted to say, if we're going to work with choreography, I'm 32, I've been doing this professionally for 14 years, I've been dancing since I was 8, the value is housed in my body. You can't buy that, but you can rehire it and you can facilitate it to happen, and I'm happy to share that. But I can't transfer this, and if I make a concept, it won't be housed in that concept. So with the services, there's this kind of underwritten thing that, that Fran, who's performing with me in this one, or Justin and Jonathan, the writer, will be hired again. So it also grants them a platform, and it grants them a platform to revisit the work and to come back to the work, and in this weird kind of freelance way, it's this tiny little grain of security that is also, yes, it's the work that I author, but I author it with the kind of contingent plan that we are the 3 subjects that deliver the service. So I think my authorship of the frame of the service as a work, as part of my practice, is different to the shared authorship within, how Fran and I kind of do this work. So that's also one thing, one thing that I think really differentiates this model from a kind of other model or a precedent model.
Now, I wanted to talk about choreographic service number 3, some writing, in a bit more detail. Maybe just to start to break apart the constituent parts, because there are quite clear parts to this work. As you immediately enter the space, you're confronted with the contract, which is one aspect of the work, of course. You're confronted by yourself and Fran as performers. There are very specific costumes, and there are very specific texts that you and Fran enunciate as you perform or deliver the service. So I wanted to talk a little bit about those different parts, but first of all to start with the 2 texts that are recited by yourself and Fran, and if you could just say a few words about what those are, why you chose to commission them, and the subjects.
Well, I was really interested in how much, as I said before, like I've been working a lot around language and interested in these forms of language also that are used to produce kind of cultural activity and support it. And I was really interested for some writing in this idea that so much of cultural production is supported by this kind of linguistic context, like what we're doing now, basically. And I was interested in the potential for a work to collapse that, for the work to contain its own context, and to, through the dynamics of the performing body, to somehow kind of like enliven or saturate or even kind of like complicate that linguistic context. And so I decided to commission 2 writers to write what is ostensibly like a catalogue essay with a particular thematic. So Catherine Damon wrote about a kind of like overview of how we could consider embodiment today, and particularly choreographic embodiment. And Sarah Lara Greyer wrote about like economies of performance, or thinking about performance as service, thinking about the people that service performance, and so kind of began from there, and they wrote these kind of what I would consider like a catalogue essay or an extended kind of institutional work description, let's say. And Fran and I each recite one of the texts. We each have memorized one of the texts, and we recite it whilst doing this very particular form of movement, which is a kind of derivative of a kind of popping movement, but it's kind of drawn out and extended and like made kind of like pulled out. And so what I was interested with, why I was interested in this popping movement, was that it felt like when I was thinking about it, it was like, oh, this is so linguistic. Like it's like punctuation. These very minimal articulate jerks that happen around the body. This looks like syllables to me, or it looks like forms of punctuation. So it's almost like, why I call it some writing is that the text rides the body rides the text. They're interwoven, and they're kind of punctuating each other.
If I take another quote from the text that Fran...
I didn't answer that. I didn't answer that first one, maybe.
No, it's okay. We go back to that. So the text that Fran recites is broken down into sections, or to numbered sections, and 16 is this movement is called popping. It evokes the quick contraction and release of specific isolated muscles, the arms or the legs, the torso or the neck, causing the body to jerk or pop. So that kind of illustrates to me that you really are, with the text and with the performance, really kind of opening up the toolbox to the viewer, to the person that engages with the service in the space. You really are revealing all of your tools. What purpose do you see that having?
Good question. Well, I mean, in that, it does do that, and I think the contract to a certain degree does that too. I mean, but here we really get into like the nitty-gritty of like the material. If I'm really honest, you know, when I commissioned Catherine and Sarah, we were involved in discussions about the work and what I saw, but there was no moment where I like briefed them specifically on what was to be written. So that was almost like I could say that was coming from like Catherine's desire in a way to like spell things out. I think what happens in Fran's text that I really like is that there is this moment where you're brought right down to like the kind of microscopic unveiling, let's say, of what's happening, or you know, like really like opening up this toolbox, and so it really gets to like the kind of there's really kind of like rooted basics of what we're doing, but then she flips that, and maybe the next line she starts talking about like what year that was that people say that popping may have evolved, and that women were not yet allowed to teach in the institution or learn in the institution that Catherine teaches, which is Columbia University. So she's like, you're kind of going from the micro to the macro a lot in that text. So I think if it was all the way through and just this like unpeeling of the onion, like just deconstructing until you get, I don't know if that would be so effective, but I think that's like one instance where actually in that text Catherine's being very associative about being in this backseat of this taxi and looking at this taxi driver put moisturizer on his face, you know. So it's like she's in her way of moving through all these different perceptions of what embodiment could be today. She lands right in this room and then spins off from that. So I think in that way it's effective. Yeah.
Both of the writers are known and respected writers, and I wondered to what extent you release control. So in this instance, you had no control over what they would write, but then in the service you wear the title of the text on your back, for instance. As a choreographer, to what extent do you exert control over the piece, working with another dancer?
Great question. Yeah, you know, I think it's always different. You know, my material is the people that I work with, and that is so, that's the major thing in my work that comes back to inform me, is complicated, is like a life's work, because, yeah, it's people, you know? So, and desires and egos and capabilities and but I like to really think hard about the people that I invite in and have you know, long conversations with them and lay it very clear, like, this is part of my practice, this is where I would love to grant you agency, this is where I will take authorship, and I learned that. I also learned that the hard way. But with Catherine and Sarah, it was amazingly fluid, and they're both amazing writers, and I approached them because I had read their work and was really interested in their work, and you know, it evolved through conversation, but there was, you know, they both take very different formats of writing. Like Catherine does this kind of associative bullet point list. Sarah does this amorphous kind of poem that rambles on, and that was completely their choice. And they were totally up for being edited, but when I got the first draft, I was really happy with both of the texts. And I think that came because we'd been speaking for like 3 months, you know, and because they both, you know, you just know if someone is on board, you know if someone is thinking with you, you know, like, you know from that first conversation, are we, like, how does this jive? And it's like really instinctual, and it's really, and it's great. It's the hard part of the work, and it's really also the most pleasurable.
We talked an awful lot about the kind of theoretical underpinnings of the work. I wanted to talk a little bit about the movement, the kind of physicality of the performance. Over all 3 services, you've had very different approaches and movements. I wondered if you could share with us why, in this instance, you arrived at the kind of interpretation of popping, and how pragmatically that developed for you as a choreographer.
Well, I'm classically trained, and then did all kinds of like modern and contemporary techniques. And I'm pretty much interested in, I can say I'm pretty much interested in all dance forms. Like there's no hierarchy for me. And that's also like a politic in my work. Like, that, you know, these kind of like canonized forms that are housed within the like histories of theater are no more valuable than quote unquote like social dances, or, and I'm actually like really interested in, you know, in a form like popping has a very specific history, and I'm interested in, coming from the background that I have, in somehow like inviting that into like my arsenal of, and seeing what happens when a form like that intersects with the kind of body that I or Fran has, the kind of physical history that we have, and in the contract, you know, I think I call it an adagio-like popping, because we produce these very kind of like held, statuesque, or maybe even like linear shapes that maybe more come from the backgrounds of modernist techniques that we have, but has this kind of is rooted in these articulated singular pops, these hits around the different joints of the body, and I guess what I'm really interested in the work, and also like why I worked with Glide, is to somehow level these hierarchies within dance forms. It's like, oh, well, like popping belongs to a certain, you know, kind of culture that has not really had a place within other houses of culture, and maybe it's more likely seen in like YouTube videos. It's got this, you know, it's ostensibly categorized as a street form, you know, and it has a very specific African American history, which, you know, has then dispersed and is needs to be kind of credited as having the history that it does, but has dispersed and so what happens when you know these bodies start to become more plural and these histories intersect without disrespecting the kind of origin. So this is an interest, and this is also why I work with gliding in some proximity, or why I work with mimesis in something. I mean, mimesis is, in contemporary dance, mimesis is the most vulgar thing, you know, like, you know, it's like out of the window, you know, it's like you can't be interested in mime in contemporary dance. It's so uncool, you know, and it's super interesting to me. Also for that reason, like where is this value placed? You know, it's like really cool to roll around on the floor, but to like mime cleaning a room is like so unintellectual apparently. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, yeah, that really fascinates me, you know? So, yeah.
An observation I made about the popping is it would be something that you would imagine would take place on the dance floor or on the street, where the viewer or the spectator is on the same level, the same physical level as the performer. And also that there is a question mark over whether someone would dance in that manner to be viewed or to be physically kind of engaged in the movement in relation to the music.
Right.
So I suppose there's two questions I have, and one question is how your service number 3 relates to the viewer in the space. Because as a viewer and experiencing the work, I think there's something very direct in the movements that kind of do parallel some of those dance floor street kind of connotations. And also then how you relate to the soundtrack which plays in the space, which is quite hypnotic, and it is quite primal in a sense.
Well, what's interesting about popping is that it really came from, I mean, in its kind of intention, it was like, okay, like hit each individual muscle or limb on the beat. So it became like an amplification of the beat. I mean, that's what it was, and in a way, like how we're not working so far away from that. We're like using it to amplify the text, which in itself, in the way we do it, becomes kind of rhythmical, or it has these rhythmical moments. It also has these internal monologue moments. It has these more kind of like outwardly spoken moments. So I think, yeah, there is this, somehow this convergence of this kind of, yeah, this like felt rhythmical thing that's happening instead of with music, but more with the text. And yeah, I don't know, I this question about like how it's, how does that relate to the viewer? I mean, I think that there's a potential real closeness, you know, the viewer in this room can get really close to us, and so maybe it can produce a certain dynamism that is like very proximate, that this form has the potential to produce, and so I think that works. It's very detailed. It's very intimate. These hits on the syllables of the text. It's like, you know, it's very intimate, and I think maybe that body-to-body intimacy of the viewer and the doer that happens in this room may be some kind of similar intimacy that happens in a club or on the street, or, you know, that is not housed within this, you know, proscenium frame of theatre. You know, you're already not seated. You know, why working in these spaces for dance is really interesting is that, you know, the viewer has the potential for a much more liberal experience.
Mm-hmm.
They can sit and move and walk out and walk back in and join in. You don't have, in the social contract of the theatre, you don't really have that. Yeah, you could maybe sit there and pop in the dark, but you know, and people, you know, I notice that when I'm doing these works, like, for better or for worse, people, because there's a body in this room moving, looking at you, potentially, they feel on show.
Mm-hmm.
They feel involved. Sometimes they hate that. They walk out immediately. Mm-hmm. And other people really relish it, you know? So there's more of a spectrum of experience, I think, that the viewer can tap into. And that's completely different to the theatre.
We do have an opportunity for questions if anyone has any questions. Do we have any questions? No. Okay, there's two, one from the very back and then one from the gentleman in the front.
I haven't seen the piece yet, I'll see it afterwards. So my question is so related to this work. It's more, I'm curious in Berlin and how Berlin starts doing your work, because I know that you, well, from what I understand, I don't want to generalise, most Berlin is full of artists that made their name in their home countries or other countries, and they moved to Berlin as a base or crossroads. But you actually seem to have made your name in Berlin within a performance culture which is very much German language. And it's more the international contemporary art scene, which is English language, and performance cultures very much as a default German. And I'm just curious what you think about that, how your work stands there, and how, I'm just curious about that. And also the UK, which is probably the closest, the closest English language speaking country to you, is probably unlikely to bring your work here because we don't really do that. We don't really import theatre or dance to this country, avoid continental Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just curious.
Yeah. Well, personally, I mean, I have a history here. I went to school here, to the Royal Ballet School, and then I worked here. I lived here till I was 25. So I lived here for 10 years. So it's a context that I know. But it's true. I had to. At the time, I was still performing for other people, and I had to leave London because there was not enough of interest to me in the dance and theatre world. And now working back here, like in the last couple of years, thus far the work that I've done here has been in the visual arts. So it's kind of like a different access or channel into a UK cultural experience. But it's, the theatre scene and theatre and dance and performance scene in Germany is really rich. And it goes back to, how even, in performance and the performing arts were valued even in like the Weimar period. And it's been something that has continued and has very different kind of pockets. So you have like the Stadttheater model, or you have like the Hebel am Ufer Theatre, which is the one that I work with, which is the independent theatre. You have a lot of different kind of off-space, artist space performance things happening. I mean, I can't necessarily say, oh, well, my work has developed in a certain way because I have been in Germany, because it's 21st century and it's global, and even if I was based in Berlin since 2010, I was traveling a lot. I was in discussion with in dialogue with a lot of artists and a lot of people around my work that are kind of international, but maybe Berlin specifically has this attribute where people go and see stuff. Like there's a huge following for theater and dance, and there's a huge hunger, and people really, like, what I've noticed is people really drop in, and they will watch things for a long time, and there's a culture of not being scared to be critical, so they will come straight to you right after and pull your piece apart, and that's like heartbreaking, but has been so valuable for my work, like this context of people that I've met there. I can't comment on the theatre or dance scene in the UK anymore because, I haven't been here for the last 5 years, and I haven't shown my work here in that context. So, yeah.
I think we have another question from the gentleman there.
Hi. So if you could maybe explain what it's like or what it takes to remain the chorus when performing for an hour or so where the audience is absent. And you mentioned performing without the audience is a duty that is interesting one to me, and possibly the consequences of them joining in.
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. Like, it's something that I really wasn't planning for. Like, I made these works and they're available for hire, and then you're hired for a day, and a day is always 5 hours. So, then I'm like in hour 3, and it's like boring and like dull, and I'm doing the same thing, and I really wasn't planning that the experience of doing these works would somehow like have this like would inform me. I was so focused on like the making of the work, constructing it conceptually, what I was doing, and then I was like, oh wow, like I have to actually do this. And yeah, I think energetically it's like exciting, and then it's boring, and then you find a new way in, and you find another way to vocalize that bit, or I find another action that cleans the space, So out of the boredom, out of the kind of like dullness of it, opens up something else. I think it's what I noticed and what I thought about like yesterday, the day before yesterday, is when I'm performing these kind of 1 hour works or 1.5 hour works in the theater that are maybe more dynamic in terms of their sequencing, and is that I don't even have the time to reflect of how this thing feels, of how what's my response to how it's viewed. That can only happen afterwards, and it's this like frenzied, like trying to like recapture that moment. But with these works, I'm really like living in them, like, so yeah, I feel like I'm kind of living with the work, and that's a really different feeling. So it can be like very daily, and it can, and there's like almost even like a fond, there can, as much as there's like a, it's like living with a lover, it's like there's like a fondness of that dailiness, but there's also a complete like boredom and like, like, can you just get out of here? So it has this kind of dialectical thing that's
yourself then.
Sorry?
Is your like attention span of the lover Is it an internal relationship?
No, I think it's really with the work, with the task. You know, it's like how I feel about the task, and there's so you're in the work and you're doing the task, and I have time to think and reflect, and I might, you know, like, from what do I want to eat for dinner to like, oh, I have to reply to that email, or, you know, so I'm like really living in these works, and that's an interesting thing, because this notion of performance is so predicated on, you know, on creating something spectacular, but when you're like living in it and you're doing it, and performance becomes this, or performing becomes this, like, just this thing that is very ordinary, and that ordinariness can be really beautiful, actually, and I think that doesn't happen so much in my experience in the theatre.
We have time for one more question from someone over this side.
Yeah, I just wonder how much do you charge for a service, if you want to make that explicit?
Oh, totally.
And depending on the price...
Where I'm available for hire?
No, and then I wonder if you feel exploited by the space, by the gallery space, by moving from the theatre to the... I don't know, it seems like for the last 5 years probably there is such a big demand of dance being in the gallery. And it seems like maybe probably they are attracted by this beauty or skill or something that the choreographer or the dancer has, which...
Yeah, or the typical one is like, we have this permanent collection, can you come and make it spark? You know what I mean? And it's like, I think that's really at the root of the services, is that there's a certain safeguarding of that exploitation of this expertise of dance. Like, the deal is laid out. If you want to work with me, if you want to hire, then here are the conditions, you know? So, I mean, there's always going to be a certain fetishization that goes back and forth within any kind of exchange of culture, you know? I mean, that's, you know, we're curious, we want to look at it, we want to understand it. I mean, that's already the, you know, the kind of seed of fetishization. But there is something in these works where they stake their rules of operation. Some cleaning is currently €200 an hour, €800 for a 5-hour day. Some proximity is €450 an hour, €2,000 for a 5-hour day, and some writing has not been priced yet. So, because it's just happened now. However, we came up with a specific price, which is on the contract, which takes into account that the ICA facilitated the making of this work. So, for this instance, it's priced at €125 per hour. But that also takes into account that they are almost like the patron of enabling this work to be made. It will be more expensive than that. You can call my gallery if you're interested in the future.
So we've hired some writing for 27.5 hours.
Yeah.
And we have 11.5 left, if I've added that up. So the service resumes at 2:30. Therefore, we need to clear the space. So thank you all for coming.